My name is Clara. I'm on the brink of my 40th birthday, and my story is a tale of a life that seemed to promise happiness and stability, but turned into a tormenting nightmare. I am a stepmother, married to a man I deeply love, who in turn brought two sons from his first marriage into our family life. Their names were Edward and Lucas. Edward had turned 21, and Lucas was 18. Life in Nebraska, with its endless fields and open sky, promised hope, but fate had other plans. When I first became part of their family, I thought I could find a common language with his sons. I knew that the role of a stepmother was not a straight path to the hearts of children. In the beginning, our relationship resembled a glassed-in winter garden, beautiful and cold, with fragile attempts at warmth that constantly collided with the icy armor of alienation. But I believed that over time, I could melt this ice. That day started like any other. My husband, whom I call Jacob, had gone on another business trip, leaving me alone with his sons. I was standing in the kitchen, inhaling the aroma of spices that slowly filled the house. It seemed like it would be an ordinary evening that would end with a family dinner. But fate had a surprise in store for me that would turn my life upside down. I heard heavy footsteps coming from upstairs. The kitchen door swung open, and Edward rushed in. His face was pale as flour, and his eyes were frozen in horror. His words were like a knife to the heart. "Clara, come upstairs quickly. Lucas. Something's wrong with him," he blurted out, barely catching his breath. My heart sank. I threw the towel I was drying my hands with and rushed after Edward. He led me to his younger brother's room, and I already imagined the worst scenarios. What could I expect? An accident? Illness? But what I saw was beyond my comprehension. When I stepped into Lucas's room, my mind refused to believe the reality for a moment. He was standing in the middle of the room, completely naked. His eyes burned with a dark, frightening light, as if someone else had taken residence within him. Edward stood frozen behind me, his face expressing a mix of fear and something I couldn't recognize. This was the beginning of my inner catastrophe, which stretched over many long months. Lucas took a step forward, and I instinctively stepped back, but the door behind me slammed shut. For a moment I felt trapped. "Clara, you have to understand," he said in a voice that sounded strangely calm, almost monotonous, which only increased my concern. His gaze pierced me like an icy blade. Edward added softly, almost in a whisper, "You can't pretend anymore that our family is just you and Jacob." His words seemed meaningless, but his tone and expression said more than words. My mind refused to comprehend what was happening. "What are you doing?" I shouted, my voice breaking into a scream. I tried to break through to the door, but their hands clasped my shoulders like steel shackles. At that moment, I realized I was in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. The room seemed to shrink around me. Lucas approached, and I felt a cold sweat running down my back. His gaze was devoid of human warmth. Something sinister lurked in it. I tried to break free from their grip, but my strength failed me. The silence of the room pressed harder than any sound. It filled me with panic and unbearable confusion. "You're both crazy. Let me go right now," I screamed, but my voice trembled, betraying my fear. Lucas and Edward exchanged glances. They seemed to understand each other without words. Their unity against me was frightening and paralyzing. Edward, the older of the brothers, spoke. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but each word hit me like a bell tolling. "Clara, you don't understand, but this has to happen. You're not just Jacob's wife. You're more than that." His words poisoned my mind, each one striking like venom. Lucas stood nearby, his face frozen in an expression of absolute calm. "You're ours. You've always been ours," he said with a certainty that made my skin crawl. These words, spoken in such an icy tone, undermined my inner resistance. I lunged for the door, hoping for a miracle, but Edward grabbed my shoulder, holding me back. His strength was greater than I expected. "Clara, this is your home. Why are you trying to run away?" His voice sounded like a mix of mockery and threat. My head spun, and I felt fear consuming me completely. They were no longer my husband's children. They had become strangers, outsiders who were breaking my will. Every step, Every word they said robbed me of my strength. Minutes stretched into eternity. My consciousness fought with reality, trying to deny what was happening, but my body wouldn't listen. They controlled everything. My fear, my weakness, my helplessness. I felt like I was drowning in this nightmare, with no way out. When the door finally swung open and they let me go, I ran out of the room as if escaping a fire. I locked myself in the bathroom, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know how this could have happened. How could those I considered family become the cause of my destruction? I looked in the mirror, expecting to see my reflection, but instead, a stranger stared back at me. Her eyes were filled with fear, her face betraying horror. I no longer knew who I was. Perhaps a minute passed or maybe an hour. The sound of water running from the faucet seemed like the only thing connecting me to reality. I understood that I needed to find a way out of this nightmare, but fear kept me paralyzed. I sat on the floor, hugging my knees, until I heard Edward's voice outside the door. "We won't hurt you. Just talk to us." His words sounded so convincing that I almost believed him. But it was a trap. I knew they wouldn't stop. My main task was to find a way to protect myself, to find a way out. However, a feeling of hopelessness grew inside me. The home that had been my fortress had become my cage. That night, when Jacob returned home, I tried to seem normal. I smiled, pretending that nothing had happened. But inside me, darkness was growing. Every word, every touch from my husband reminded me of the lie I was living. Lucas and Edward acted as if nothing had happened. At dinner they laughed, talking about their day, and none of us three gave anything away. But I saw their glances, heard their silent threats. They were playing with me like a puppet in their nightmarish theater. Every night became torture. I lay in bed next to Jacob, feeling my soul being torn apart by the weight of what had happened. I felt like I was suffocating in my own skin, but I couldn't make myself tell him the truth. His love and trust were the last thread connecting me to reality, and I was afraid to lose them if I opened up. Gradually, I realized that I had to act. But how? This question burned me from within. I was afraid to lose everything, but I also understood that silence could destroy me. I woke up the next morning with a heavy weight on my chest, as if someone had placed a stone there. The sunlight filtering through the curtains seemed mocking, as if the world continued to turn despite the storm raging inside me. I looked at Jacob. His face in sleep was peaceful, serene. This peace cut me from within. I slipped out of bed quietly, so as not to wake him, and went to the kitchen. There, I stood by the window, looking out at the endless fields of Nebraska. The fields that I had always found soothing now looked empty and lonely just like me. I had no plan, no hope, only despair. Edward entered the kitchen as if nothing had happened. He sat down at the table and calmly poured himself some coffee. His smile was friendly, but there was something dark in his eyes that made me shrink. "Good morning, Clara. You didn't sleep last night?" he asked with an intonation that sounded almost caring. I turned away to hide my emotions, but he continued. "We all want you to feel like part of the family. Maybe you should relax." His words sounded harmless, but I felt a hidden threat in them. This was his way of reminding me that I was now a captive. I began to notice small details. Lucas and Edward no longer looked at me the way they used to. Their gazes were intense, scrutinizing, as if they were looking for a weak spot. They became more attentive to me, surrounding me with care that was actually a form of control. I felt like a mouse cornered by two cats who enjoyed the process. With each passing day, my mask cracked more and more. I tried to live as before, to be a good wife and stepmother, but inside me anxiety gnawed. Jacob noticed nothing, and this scared me. His blindness made me even more alone. One evening, when Jacob was late from work, Edward approached me. His voice was soft, but each sound cut like glass. "You know, we don't need Jacob to be a family, right?" I froze, trying to understand what he meant, but he didn't give me time to think. "You can be with us, Clara. Only with us. And we'll take care of you." These words evoked a storm of emotions in me. Anger, pain, disgust. But I couldn't give in to any of them. Instead, I just nodded and retreated to my room, locking the door. Behind that door, I allowed myself to cry. These were the first tears I had shed since the nightmare began. The next day, I tried to find some support. I called my friend Meg, who lived in the neighboring town. She was the only person I could trust. I need to talk, I said, trying not to let my voice tremble. Meg didn't ask unnecessary questions. She agreed to meet in a cafe so I could tell her everything. But sitting over a cup of coffee, I couldn't utter a word. She looked at me with genuine concern, but I just smiled and said that everything was fine. I was afraid that if I told her, the consequences would be catastrophic. My days turned into a routine of lies. I smiled at Jacob, communicated with friends, pretended that everything was fine. But inside, I was crumbling. Every night, as I lay in bed, I heard the footsteps of Edward and Lucas outside the door. They didn't cross the boundaries of my room, but their presence was palpable. They wanted me to know they were there. One night, I woke up to a sound that resembled a scraping. The room was dark, but I felt that I was not alone. The light from the hallway illuminated the gap under the door, and I saw a shadow that had stopped. Someone was standing there. I pressed myself against the headboard, unable to breathe. But after a few minutes, the shadow disappeared. That was the moment when I realized I couldn't stay silent any longer. But telling Jacob everything meant destroying not only my life, but his as well. I knew that the truth would shatter everything we had built together. But how long could I live with this burden? How long could I keep up this mask? Every day, I asked myself the same question. Who am I now? Victim? Accomplice? Or just a woman trapped? And every day, the answer became more and more unclear. Night after night, the shadow behind the door became my new companion. I could no longer distinguish what was real and what was a product of my fear. It seemed that Edward and Lucas were playing a game where I was their victim, and my fear was their reward. However, their actions went beyond innocent provocations. They were invading my world, and I knew this wouldn't end on its own. One evening, when Jacob was away on another business trip, I was left alone with the brothers. The evening seemed ordinary. I sat in the living room with a book in my hands, trying to look calm. Lucas and Edward were playing a video game on the console. Their laughter sounded so natural that I almost believed it was an ordinary family. But then everything changed. Lucas turned off the game and turned to me. His face expressed a strange combination of childish innocence and something sinister. "Clara, have you ever thought about what it means to be honest?" he asked with a slight smile. His question caught me off guard. "What do you mean, Lucas?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But inside, I already knew this conversation wouldn't end well. "You're pretending," Edward interjected. His voice was soft, but it sounded even more threatening because of it. "You're acting like everything is normal. You're acting like we're just your stepchildren. But that's not true, is it?" My heart beat faster. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to buy time. Lucas stood up from the couch and came closer. "You're part of us. And you know it. Stop hiding behind this mask of the perfect stepmother." His words sounded like a verdict. I felt the air in the room grow heavy, as if it were saturated with their presence. Their steps, their voices, even their gazes. Everything seemed like a conspiracy against me. I was alone in the house with these two, and no one knew what was happening to me. "You can't talk to me like that," I said, trying to maintain some confidence in my voice. But my words were empty, like an echo in an empty hall. Lucas leaned in closer, his eyes shining. "We can do whatever we want. You won't tell Jacob. You're too afraid to ruin his life. And you know what? That makes you weak." His words pierced me like an icy blade. I stood up, trying to keep my distance from them. "You don't understand what you're doing. This is wrong." My words trembled, but I tried to sound convincing. Edward laughed. His laughter was cold, almost mechanical. "Right? Wrong. Those are concepts for people who are afraid of their desires. And we're not afraid, Clara. And it's time for you to stop being afraid too." Those words were the final straw. I ran out of the room and locked myself in my bedroom. I heard their footsteps outside the door, heard their voices, but I couldn't make out the words. Fear paralyzed me. I sat on the floor, hugging my knees, and prayed for all of this to be just a bad dream. The next morning, I made a decision. I had to do something. But what? Go to the police? Tell Jacob? But what would I say? Your sons are harassing me. It would sound like nonsense. They hadn't left any traces that I could prove. Only the fear inside me. I decided to start by writing down everything that was happening. I bought a diary and began to describe every encounter, every conversation in detail. This was the only thing I could do to maintain some connection to reality. But even this didn't give me a sense of security. One day, as I sat at the table writing in my diary, Lucas entered the kitchen. He looked at me with a slight smirk. "What are you writing there, Clara?" "A little girl's diary." His words sounded mocking, but there was a warning in his gaze. "That's none of your business," I replied, trying to sound confident. But he didn't back down. He came closer and looked down at me. "Do you think this will help you? Do you think paper will protect you?" His voice was soft, but I heard the threat in it. Edward joined him. "We just want you to be honest, Clara. With us and with yourself. Is that so hard?" His smile was too wide to be genuine. I felt my resolve cracking. They knew how to play on my fear. I understood that I needed to act quickly, while I still had the strength. That night, I wrote a letter to Jacob. I didn't reveal all the details, but I hinted that something was wrong. "I feel out of place," I wrote. "We need to talk when you get back." But even after writing this, I wasn't sure I could tell him everything. The next day, I left the letter on the table to send it to Jacob by mail. This was my only way to share at least part of what I was going through. Pressing the send button on an email seemed too risky. Edward and Lucas were everywhere. Their presence reminded me of shadows that couldn't be ignored. A postal letter was a safer, albeit slower option. All day, I avoided contact with them. I excused myself with work, phone calls, and household chores. But in the evening, avoiding their company became impossible. We sat down for dinner. The atmosphere at the table was charged with tension, like before a storm. Jacob still wasn't back, and his absence made everything even more unsettling. Edward looked at me with a slight smile. "You're very quiet today, Clara. Is something wrong?" His voice was soft, but I felt the underlying threat. I looked up, trying not to show my fear. "Everything's fine. Just a little tired." I tried to sound natural, but my voice betrayed my inner tension. Lucas pushed his plate away and crossed his arms. "Interesting. What were you writing so intently this morning? You looked very focused." His question sounded casual, but I knew it was an attempt to corner me. "Those are just notes for work," I quickly replied, averting my gaze. But I felt their gazes boring into me. They knew I was lying, and I realized that this was a game of survival. After dinner, I locked myself in the bedroom again. My heart was pounding so hard that it seemed audible even through the closed door. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding my head in my hands, trying to figure out what to do next. The letter had already been sent, but what if they found out? What if Jacob didn't believe me? These thoughts pulled me down like quicksand. I understood that I was taking a step into the unknown, but I had no other choice. Later that night, I heard footsteps outside the door. This had become familiar, but this time they stopped. Someone knocked. A light, almost delicate knock. "Clara, are you awake?" It was Edward's voice. I didn't answer. My heart beat even faster. "We know you're afraid of us," he continued after a short pause. His voice was strangely calm. "But you need to understand that we just want you to be honest. It's not that hard." I remained silent, trying not to reveal my presence. The footsteps moved away, but I knew this was only a pause, a respite before something bigger. The next morning, I felt that something had changed. Lucas and Edward were strangely calm. They didn't ask questions, didn't look at me with their usual intensity. This seemed suspicious, but I decided to use this moment. I went to town to distract myself and think. In a cafe on the corner, where the locals usually gathered, I ordered coffee and sat by the window, watching the people passing by. The world outside seemed so normal, so far from the chaos that was tearing my life apart. I noticed a postal truck driving by. This reminded me of the letter I had sent to Jacob. I wondered when he would receive it. Would it be a shock to him? Or perhaps a chance for us both to start a conversation that I had been putting off for so long? But as soon as I returned home, reality hit me again. Edward was standing by the window in the living room, looking at me like a predator spotting its prey. You were in town? His voice sounded too calm. This calmness always scared me more than shouting. Yes, I needed to get away, I replied, trying to keep myself together. Interesting, from what? He took a step toward me, and then another. Lucas appeared from around the corner, blocking my path to the door. I realized that they knew. Maybe they had seen the letter. Maybe they just suspected. But one thing was clear. My attempt to fight this nightmare had only made them more insistent. Lucas came closer, and I felt a chill run through my body. Clara, we're not enemies. You're making us into monsters, but we just want you to be honest with yourself and with us, he said softly, but his words sounded like a verdict. I tried to hide my fear, but my body betrayed me. My hands were shaking, my breath was rapid. I needed to escape, but I didn't know how. These two had turned my home into a trap, and my life into an endless nightmare. That night was long. I lay in bed, trying to come up with a new plan. I knew this was only the beginning, that their pressure would intensify. All I could do was wait for Jacob's response, and hope that he would believe me. At dawn, I was awakened by the ringing of the phone. My heart stopped. It could only be Jacob. I picked up the receiver with trembling hands. Clara. His voice sounded concerned. I could barely hold back the tears. Jacob. My voice trembled. I couldn't get a word out. I got your letter. What's going on? You mentioned some tension? Can you explain? There was confusion and worry in his voice. I took a deep breath. This was my chance to tell him everything, but the words wouldn't come out. How could I explain this? How could he believe that his sons, whom he loved and raised, had turned me into a hostage in my own home? Clara, I'll be home in 2 days. We'll talk, okay? His voice softened. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Okay, I whispered. It was a weak response, but I had no more strength. The next 2 days passed in a haze. Lucas and Edward remained suspiciously calm. They no longer made hints, didn't come close to me. This was like the calm before the storm. I tried to keep as far away from them as possible, but every glance, every movement of theirs seemed like a threat to me. On the day of Jacob's return, I was in terror. What should I say? How could I explain what I was feeling? All I knew was that I couldn't live in this lie anymore. When Jacob entered the house, he hugged me, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. His warmth and care were my anchor in this stormy sea. Is something wrong? He asked, looking at me intently. I looked at him, trying to find the words. But before I could say anything, Edward and Lucas entered the room. Their appearance was unexpected, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Dad, can we talk to you? Edward began before I could open my mouth. Jacob frowned, looking at them, and then turned his gaze to me. What's this about? He asked warily. Clara is trying to make us look bad, Lucas said, his voice sounding aggrieved. But in his eyes I saw triumph. We don't know what we did, but she's avoiding us and acting strangely. That's not true. My voice broke. I couldn't contain my anger. They're manipulating you, Jacob. They're threatening me, tormenting me. I was afraid to tell you, but it's the truth. A deathly silence fell over the room. Jacob looked at me, then at his sons. That's a serious accusation, he said finally. Dad, she just wants to destroy our family, Edward said, his voice sounding too confident. My head spun. I couldn't believe this was happening. I wanted to run, to hide, but I had to fight. Jacob, you have to believe me. Everything I'm saying is true. He took a deep breath, his face expressing pain and doubt. I don't know who to believe, he said. His words pierced me like a knife. Night fell, leaving me in complete despair. Jacob said he needed time to figure things out, but I felt that time was against me. I locked myself in the bedroom, trying to think of what to do next. But my fear was so strong that I couldn't think. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside the door. Someone was standing there, and I knew it wasn't Jacob. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. The doorknob turned slowly, but the door was locked. Clara will win anyway, Lucas whispered. His words were like poison seeping into my consciousness. I didn't sleep all night, sitting in the corner of the room. In the morning, Jacob entered. His face was haggard, as if he hadn't slept. Clara, I'll call someone who can help us sort this out. We'll talk to a specialist, he said. His words gave me a glimmer of hope, but I knew this would be a long journey. The truth hadn't won yet, but I was no longer alone.